The Narnia franchise didn't fail because the films were bad. It failed because the people who made them never understood what they actually had.
Spoilers ahead. In 2005, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe opened to $65 million in its first weekend, earned nearly $745 million worldwide, and was immediately positioned as the next great fantasy franchise, the heir to what Peter Jackson had built with Tolkien, the property that would define a decade the way The Ring had defined the one before it. 3 films later, the series was dead. Not killed by a box office catastrophe, not destroyed by critical evisceration, but quietly abandoned, dropped by one studio, picked up by another, handed to a streaming platform with modest ambitions and a release date that came and went without the culture noticing. That trajectory, from coronation to irrelevance in less than 8 years, is not an accident. It is the result of specific, traceable decisions, each one defensible in isolation, collectively fatal, and worth examining with precision, because they illuminate something true about how Hollywood processes source material it respects without actually understanding. The foundational error was misidentifying the competition. When Andrew Adamson began developing the first film, the industry's reference point was unavoidable. The Fellowship of the Ring had released in 2001, The Return of the King had won 11 Academy Awards in 2004, and the critical and commercial logic of the moment suggested that epic fantasy was a genre defined by scale, weight, and the feeling of a world that had existed for centuries before the camera arrived. The assumption that Narnia should compete in that register was understandable, and it was wrong in a way that compounded with every subsequent production decision. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were friends, contemporaries, members of the same Oxford literary circle, but they were building fundamentally different things. Tolkien's ambition was mythological in the most literal sense. He wanted to create an ancient cosmology, a linguistic and historical substrate so deep that Middle-earth would feel geologically real, the kind of world that existed in full before the story began and would continue after it ended. Lewis's ambition was theological and intimate. Narnia is not a world that feels ancient in Tolkien's sense. It feels discovered, the way a child discovers something that was always there, waiting, behind an ordinary piece of furniture in an ordinary house. The emotional register is personal, immediate, luminous. The lamppost in the snow, the warmth of the beaver's house, the first sight of Aslan. And that emotional register depends entirely on intimacy, on the sense that this magic was made for you specifically, not for the sweep of history. The moment you scale that intimacy into spectacle, you begin destroying the thing that made it matter. The first film felt this tension acutely. The early scenes in Narnia carried something real, a quality of careful wonder that suggested the filmmakers had understood what they were adapting. Then the third act arrived, and the film pivoted into a large-scale battle sequence that could have been lifted, without significant alteration, from a dozen other fantasy properties released in the same decade. The wonder didn't survive the collision with spectacle. It rarely does. Every long-form franchise built around child protagonists faces a structural reality that no studio wants to confront directly. Children age, and they age at a rate that is incompatible with the storytelling logic that episodic fantasy franchises require. The Pevensey children were cast with genuine care. The performances in the first film, particularly Georgie Henley's Lucy, captured something specific and correct about the way Lewis had written these characters, a quality of belief that felt unperformed and honest. By the time Prince Caspian was released in 2008, 2 years had passed in production time, and considerably more had passed in the visible maturity of the actors. William Moseley's Peter had grown into an older teenager, and rather than find a way to make that growth serve the story's internal logic, the production made a decision that reveals everything about its creative priorities. It imported a generic reluctant hero arc onto a character whose function in Lewis's mythology was to be straightforwardly noble. Peter in Prince Caspian becomes sullen, authority-hungry, reckless, qualities that belong to a different kind of story entirely, a story about the corruption of unchecked ambition, or the psychology of someone who had power and lost it, and cannot metabolize the loss. That is, in isolation, an interesting character study. It has essentially nothing to do with who Peter Pevensey is as Lewis wrote him. The result is a character who feels psychologically borrowed, assembled from the conventions of a different genre, and placed inside Narnia because the filmmakers needed conflict they couldn't find in the source material without imposing it from outside. Susan's arc across the series reveals a related but distinct problem. Lewis wrote Susan's eventual exclusion from Narnia as a moral and theological statement. She became too interested in lipstick and nylons and invitations, which Lewis meant as an allegory for the surrender of spiritual imagination to adult materialism. The film's response to that discomfort was to simply avoid it, to present Susan as competent, heroic, and emotionally present without engaging with the trajectory Lewis had written for her. The avoidance was understandable, commercially and ethically, but it left her arc unresolved in a way that satisfied no one, neither audiences who wanted the films to engage honestly with the source material, nor audiences who would have preferred a coherent reinterpretation. Lewis was not subtle about what Narnia was. Aslan is a Christ figure, not metaphorically, not approximately, not in the way that any self-sacrificing hero can be loosely mapped onto Christian iconography, but explicitly and deliberately, with Lewis's own documented statements leaving no room for interpretive ambiguity. The stone table sequence, Aslan's death and resurrection, the logic of deep magic and deeper magic, these are not narrative devices that happen to resemble theology. They are theology, expressed through the particular idiom of children's fantasy. The entire emotional architecture of the first book and the first film depends on the audience receiving that sacrifice as genuinely sacred, not necessarily agreeing with its theological implications, but feeling the weight of what is being offered. Disney's calculation was that emphasizing the religious dimension would alienate secular audiences in a global market, and that softening it would preserve broad demographic appeal. This calculation ignored two inconvenient realities simultaneously. The first is that the faith-based audience, evangelical Christians in particular, who had organized viewing campaigns for the first film and treated it as culturally significant, was paying close attention and recognized the theological dilution immediately. The second is that what remained after the theological substance was reduced was not a neutral, universally accessible fantasy adventure. It was a story with a structural hole at its center, an emotionally hollow space where the spiritual stakes should have been, filled with sufficiently impressive production design to distract from the absence without ever replacing what was missing. The paradox resolves itself with uncomfortable clarity. Narnia's commercial advantage was its faith-based audience, which represented an organized, motivated, demographically specific viewership that would show up reliably if the material honored the source. The attempt to expand beyond that audience by softening the material weakened the very quality that made the faith-based audience reliable, without producing any compensating gain in secular viewership. You cannot serve two audiences by becoming less interesting to both of them. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is where the franchise's foundational problem became impossible to paper over, because Lewis's third book is the one that most nakedly refuses to conform to blockbuster narrative architecture. The novel is episodic, a sequence of islands, each one presenting a distinct moral test, held together by thematic resonance rather than escalating plot momentum. There is no central villain in the conventional sense, no gathering darkness that the heroes must race to prevent, no third-act convergence of all established threat lines into a single confrontation. The book is about spiritual growth, about the slow expansion of what the characters are willing to see and accept, achieving its effects through accumulation and contemplation rather than tension and resolution. It is, by the standards of contemporary blockbuster logic, almost unadaptable, not because it is poorly written, but because it operates on principles that Hollywood's story infrastructure was not designed to accommodate. The production solution was to manufacture a villain
a dark island antagonist whose function was to create the artificial narrative spine that the book doesn't provide, a centralized evil mist threat that the crew must gather magical swords to defeat. This invention served the requirements of the production template while failing on every other level. Audiences familiar with the book recognized the distortion and felt the loss of the material it displaced. Audiences unfamiliar with the book found the manufactured antagonist underdeveloped, the stakes confusing, and the resolution unsatisfying in the specific way that solutions feel unsatisfying when they solve a problem the story never actually posed. The film still made money, $415 million globally, against a $155 million budget. But the cultural conversation around it was the quietest of the three entries, and Fox's subsequent decision to drop the franchise reflected a reading of trajectory rather than absolute numbers. The pacing decisions across all three films reveal a consistent misreading of what fantasy audiences actually respond to. Epic fantasy, when it works at the level Jackson achieved, creates the feeling that the world exists beyond the edges of the frame, that the camera is revealing a small portion of something vast, and that the vastness can be felt even in its absence. This feeling is not produced by action sequences, regardless of their scale or choreographic sophistication. It is produced by patience, by the willingness to let a location, a piece of music, a character's face, or an architectural detail exist in the frame long enough for the audience to begin imagining what lies beyond it. Rivendell became an icon not because of what happened there narratively, but because Jackson let it breathe. Let the camera communicate depth that could not be verbalized. Let the audience feel that they were genuinely inside a place rather than passing through a set. Narnia's equivalent moments, the first view of the Lantern Waste, the approach to Cair Paravel, the Dawn Treader itself as a physical object, were consistently treated as connective tissue, accelerated past in the urgency to reach the next plot point, their wonder compressed into establishing shots rather than extended into experience. The films were technically proficient. The production design was frequently beautiful. The craft was not in question. What was in question was whether anyone in a decision-making position understood that in fantasy, wonder is not decoration, it is the primary substance, and everything else exists to frame it. The version of Narnia that could have worked was not the version that competed with Tolkien for epic grandeur. It was the version that understood its own nature clearly enough to pursue a different kind of cinematic authority. A coherent adaptation would have accepted, from the beginning, that the book's episodic structure was not a problem to be solved, but a structural identity to be honored, and would have designed a franchise architecture accordingly, perhaps closer to a prestige anthology than a unified escalating epic. Each film could have functioned as a self-contained moral and spiritual examination, linked by world and theme rather than continuous plot, allowing the series to breathe and reset between entries rather than accumulating the weight of an unresolvable narrative debt. The faith-based audience would have remained reliably engaged if the theological texture had been treated as the story's actual subject rather than its embarrassing subtext. The child actor's aging could have been integrated honestly, acknowledged, made thematically meaningful, rather than papered over with borrowed psychological frameworks from adjacent genres. None of this was impossible. It simply required a studio willing to make a franchise that looked and moved differently from every other franchise in the market. Which is to say, it required a level of confidence in the source material's intrinsic value that the production never quite managed to sustain under the pressure of competitive positioning. The Narnia franchise is the most instructive kind of failure in Hollywood, not the kind caused by incompetence or indifference, but the kind caused by the systematic removal of the qualities that made the source material worth adapting in the first place. Lewis's genius was not spectacle. It was a specific quality of emotional and spiritual sincerity, the sense that the magic he was offering was real in the only way that matters, which is that it pointed towards something true about the interior life of the reader.
every decision to subordinate that sincerity to franchise logic, demographic calculation, or competitive positioning relative to other fantasy properties was a decision that made the films slightly less worth caring about. The accumulation of those decisions produced something technically accomplished, intermittently beautiful, emotionally insufficient, and ultimately forgettable, which is the one thing a C.S. Lewis adaptation had no structural right to be. The studio acquired a wardrobe and turned it into a door. The problem is that doors, no matter how well constructed, do not lead anywhere worth going.